Otherwise, I'm glad I put it on. You appreciate, I haven't got a written script tonight because my officers let me down badly. But having said that, you do realise that this meeting will be filmed, recorded. Okay, so when you're speaking, if you do need to speak, and I don't suppose many of you will tonight because we've got a really heavy agenda, please use your microphones. Okay, thank you very much. So shall we go straight in then? Any apologies for absence, please?
No apologies, Chairman. Thank you.
Any Sorry, Councillor, were you going to say something? I was going to go on to declaration. Any declarations?
Could I declare, in the interest of transparency, Mr. Chairman, that although I increasingly need a wheelchair, I am not completely wheelchair dependent. But I do use a wheelchair, but I'm able to move myself into a normal seat.
So are you telling me that you have used the cabs that are adapted for using wheelchair?
I used one about 10 years ago when we got the first wheelchair accessible taxi in Christchurch, and Councillor Griffiths, the then leader, asked if I would go and try it out, as I was the one disabled member of the council at that time. So I used it to show that it was possible, but normally I use ordinary taxis.
Thank you for that, Councillor. Sorry, Councillor Smith.
It's not a pecuniary interest, but I am known to and know most of the directors of the largest cab firm in the area, and therefore, although it's no pecuniary interest to me, in interest of transparency, I just let you know every meeting we have.
Which cab firm is that then?
United.
Thank you, Councillor. Can we go on to item 3, please? No doubt you've all waded through them. I can't see anything wrong with them. I'll be happy to accept the minutes as written.
Quite happy to propose as the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. Was that a second from you, Fred? Thank you. Oh, yes, sorry, yes. Thank you for pointing that out. Shall we have a vote on the minutes then? All those in favour? Unanimous? Thank you very much. Okay, item 4, the Equality Act 2010, wheelchair accessible taxis, and I'm sure our officer is going to enthrall us. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening. Yes, the Equality Act, which came into force back in 2010, there were a number of provisions of that Act which were not enacted straight away. 2 of those, section 165 and 167, were enacted and came into force on the 6th of April this year. Excuse me. Section 167 deals with designating wheelchair accessible vehicles, and section 165 deals with the requirements on drivers of vehicles that are designated, and those are set out in section 2, but essentially it deals with that they must carry passengers in their wheelchairs if the person so requires. Now, there's no requirement to actually adopt the provisions of 167, but the government strongly recommends that local authorities do so in order to protect the equalities of wheelchair users. Now, as outlined in section 3, members have already been proactive in ensuring the needs of wheelchair users are met, and there are approved policies that, for example, prohibit charging for the carrying of wheelchairs, and to encourage the supply of wheelchair accessible vehicles, the age limit on licensing a vehicle which can do so is increased to 6 years. And there's also already published on Dorset for You a list of wheelchair accessible vehicles. Now, as I said, it's for the council to adopt and also to determine the requirements to be met should a vehicle be designated. And what is proposed at Appendix 1, and there is a revised version because the part of the diagram unfortunately got missed off. And Appendix 1 sets out the proposed dimensions of what will be referred to as a reference wheelchair. And so if a vehicle is capable of taking a wheelchair of those dimensions, that would lead to it being designated. Now, in adopting this proposal, it is recognised that some models of wheelchairs, such as the larger powered wheelchairs, for example, could not be carried safely. And so in those occurrences, it would be acceptable for the driver of the vehicle to decline to carry the passenger in the wheelchair. However, the standard that's proposed in Appendix 1 is a minimum standard, and what we will do is obviously discuss with vehicle operators, and they will be asked what size of wheelchair their vehicles could actually accommodate, and those increased details would be put on the website so that at least persons are aware that there may be an operator that could take them if their wheelchair is larger. If it is intended to designate vehicle, then if the operator wishes to contest that designation, then they can do so. And what we propose is that if we contacted an operator and said the intention is to designate your vehicle, if they indicated to us that they wished to contest that and it was on some technical matter, then what we would do is engage sort of an independent, competent person to assess the vehicle. And if they said, yes, we agree it's not appropriate, then we would withdraw the intention at that stage to save time and effort on all parts. If, however, we still felt that it was appropriate to designate that vehicle, then we could call for a hearing in front of the licensing subcommittee, and members would then be able to make that decision as to whether to designate the vehicle or not. In section 5 of the report, section 165 sets out the legal duties of drivers of designated vehicles, and it is an offence if they don't comply with those, for which they could be prosecuted. In section 6, drivers can apply for an exemption from the duties, and what is proposed is that if they wish to do so, then they need to provide suitable evidence to the council, and we suggest that that would be in the form of either a doctor or some other medical specialist's report, obviously depending what the claim for the exemption is. And the proposal is that I would be able to make that initial assessment, and again, if the exemption was refused, then the driver would have the ability to come before the subcommittee to again contest that decision. Really, the structure of the report sets out the government's recommended procedure for implementing the requirements, and that's covered in section 7 of the report. And it goes on to the process, if you like, that we will take for implementing the requirements if adopted, and that's really the route that we will follow. Section 8 deals with the fact that that it's obviously important that drivers understand, given that they could be prosecuted, what the duties are that are placed upon them. And so we will condition licences, driver and vehicle licence, such that only drivers that are suitably trained will be able to transport wheelchair passengers. Now, members have obviously previously adopted the requirement for BTEC and MVQ qualifications, and part of that qualification does deal with the carriage of wheelchair passengers, and so it is likely that in due course all drivers would be suitably qualified.
Can I just ask a quick question
Certainly.
now,
Yeah.
while we're on that subject? Their vehicles surely have got to be adapted as well, haven't they?
Yes, I mean, the only way that a vehicle would be designated is if it's adapted and capable of carrying a passenger, a wheelchair passenger in the wheelchair, should they require it.
Yeah, thanks. I'll go on to that when it comes under question.
Now, in section 9, what we're proposing is that we will apply the designated vehicles to the list commencing from the 1st of January 2019. So that effectively gives us a year to deal with any appeals against whether the vehicle should be designated, whether there's any exemptions, that type of thing. But it also will allow sufficient time for those drivers that require to undertake the qualification, that they have the time, because the courses are popular. Drivers are wanting to get on them now. They are becoming booked up. So it does allow sufficient time for an available course to be selected, so that come the 1st of January 19, the drivers should have had ample opportunity to obtain the qualification. And finally, in section 10, it's just highlighting that in spite of the internal decision-making processes and appeals to the subcommittee, that actually the owners and drivers of vehicles do have the right to go to the magistrates' court to appeal any decision that's made by the council that they might disagree with on that. Lastly, I just wanted to cover in the risk section of the report, obviously members need to be aware that if the proposal to designate vehicles is adopted, then owners of vehicles may choose not to licence the vehicle going forward because of the additional burdens that it places on them. And obviously that risk needs to be balanced against the sort of the strong government advice that councils should be looking to protect the equality and provide wheelchair users with vehicles that are accessible to them. But nonetheless, there is a risk, and we cannot force vehicle operators to adapt their vehicle or present it for designation. That the choice ultimately is theirs. But I think the important thing, obviously, is that we have in place the policy that allows us to designate the vehicle in the first place. So unless there's anything else, quite happy to take questions.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I've got a couple first, if I may. Well, section 166 and 170, it gives the drivers a get out anyway. So why would they want to advertise they've got a wheelchair accessible vehicle if they don't have to do it through physical disabilities or anything like that? And the bit you just read out to us, section 10, 172. 172 enables them to appeal against the decision. So surely a cabbie wouldn't want to carry wheelchair passengers or adapt his vehicle if he didn't want to.
No, essentially, the choice rests with the trade. What this policy is saying is that if they do designate their vehicle as being wheelchair accessible, then there are certain minimum standards that they must comply with. Ultimately, it is down to sort of supply and demand, and it is for the trade to make that decision. On the basis, it's certainly in Christchurch, there are already in operation 3 wheelchair accessible vehicles, and it really is a sort of a niche market that they could exploit, but that's down to the trade to determine.
Councillor Smith?
Thank you. I think my question's actually been answered, because it sounded from the way you were describing it that we were going to be designating taxis and telling them that they would be disabled taxis. However, my understanding now is that we can't do that. Actually, they need to make that decision, so that's fine.
Councillor Helen?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about the wheelchair size. You said it's based on the minimum standard. But is that minimum standard based on an average size wheelchair?
The dimensions in Appendix 1, which are known as a reference wheelchair, come from a different piece of legislation. It's in the report, I can't remember off the top, I think it's public service vehicle. So it is based upon the sort of standard size of wheelchair that most people would use day to day, and so should be accessible to taxis that comply with that requirement.
Any other questions for the officer, please? Shall we go into debate then? Oh, I beg your pardon, Councillor Neil.
Yes, sure. Securing the wheelchairs, is that going to be part of the regulation there?
Yes, in order to be sort of wheelchair accessible, part of the requirement, apart from obviously the space requirements, is the fixing and safety and security of the person once they're actually in the wheelchair. So that would be part of the checking process before we designated the vehicle.
Go on, Fred, but para 5.2 covers your last question.
Yeah, I know, but I just wanted to make sure that we actually had an authorised company like Rosper or the other operator to actually check on the equipment regularly, maybe annually.
Yes, I mean we obviously don't have the competency in that sense, so we would be referring it on to other competent persons to advise us in that regard.
Any more questions for the officer, please? Thank you. Shall we go into the debate? Councillor Watt.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I think I'd like to thank the officer for his extremely in-depth summation of the report. And with that, I am quite happy to propose as set out. So it's over to you, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody like to... sorry, who's going to second? You want to say something, Councillor Notch? Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think that we should encourage our taxi firms to be wheelchair friendly. After all, we are well publicised regularly for our aged population. Just recently, a population that was highest in dementia, and as we are a dementia friendly town because of your good offices, Mr. Chairman, I would be very happy encouraging us to be wheelchair friendly in our taxis, and I'd second the motion.
Thank you very much. Vicky? No? Anybody else? Yes, Councillor. We are in debate.
Yeah, Chairman, I just wanted to mention something because I've been afflicted all the day looking at the news, principally that comes from London. I always thought that it was a mistake extending the old GLC into Greater London. Now I'm absolutely sure of it. But the tenure of what has been announced today in London, which is some 10 million people out of our total population, lest you've forgotten, is going to cost money. I haven't heard that mentioned too much today, but I can see that these vehicles, once modified, will carry a second-hand price. And I can see coming back to the kind of things that happened during the Second World War, and I particularly remember at the time of Suez, that the motive unit will be altered to keep the chassis and bodywork of a vehicle like this, which has been extensively modified. I just wanted to make the point that I think that a vehicle once modified might be around for a lot longer than you think. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing as though you and I are the only people here that remember the war, I take your point. The Second World War I'm talking about. Sorry. Right, we've had a proposal, we've had it seconded. All those in favour?
It's unanimous.
Thank you. Right, moving on. Item 5, animal boarding establishments, pet shops and dog breeding. This is really good, isn't it?
Glad to bring some enjoyment to. Members previously resolved to consult licensees on the adoption of model conditions for 3 different types of licence. Those were animal boarding, pet shops and dog breeding. Dealing with animal boarding first, and that's covered in section 3 of the report. In Christchurch, currently there are 2 licensed premises licensed under the Animal Boarding Establishments Act 1963, and they are both categories. Now, one of the responses, or the one response received as at Appendix 1 on page 25, the response indicates that the council is intending to draft its own conditions. So I just wanted to be clear in the regard that we're not proposing to draft our own or to reword the model condition. We are seeking to adopt the model conditions as published. So there is perhaps a misunderstanding there. And equally, the second part there relates to a concern that we are seeking to require an increase in temperature within the whole of the cat pen. And again, just for clarity, what we are in fact saying is that the temperature in the whole of the cat pen is the same as it currently is, which is minimum temperature of 10 degrees. And the new model conditions propose that there should be an area within the cat pen that is a minimum of 15 degrees, but that can be a heated bed or a heated pad. So actually, in terms of the concern of the response, which is obviously an increase in heating costs, it's perhaps much less than if you were seeking to raise the temperature inside by 5 degrees. Paragraphs 310 and 312, they're seeking to achieve compliance by the 31st of December 2021 for all conditions, and equally 312 is not reducing numbers on the licence until the 31st of December 2019. So in other words, the licence for the 2020-2021 period. Now, as I say, in Christchurch there are currently 2 categories, no kennels, and compliance is actually considered achievable within those time frames that are set out there, because actually the works required are not hugely significant. They're more operational or management type compliance issues. Now, what we're seeking to do, and I'll come on to it in a minute, is actually to align our policies across the partnership. And the proposal now, and members have had some updated recommendations, and essentially, if you want to compare the two sets of recommendations, recommendation E has effectively been removed, and recommendation D, the compliance date, has been taken out. Now, the reason for that is because there are issues elsewhere, and to comply with those dates would involve other kennels and catteries in some quite significant expense. Now, as I say, for Christchurch, actually, if you stay with the original conditions, it won't impact on the categories that you currently license. But in terms of aligning the two, the partnerships policies, it would mean we simply have to publish two policies on Dorset for you.
So you're talking about East Dorset as well?
Yes. Yes, yeah, the report, basically an almost identical report, is going to East Dorset, and we've amended the recommendations in that one as well to be consistent. If members, as I say, are minded, then we can change the recommendations that are there. Also, for information, really, as I alluded to earlier, since this report was published, we've also received a consultation from DEFRA on a new piece of legislation, new regulations, which are referred to in their draft form as the Animal Welfare Licensing of Activities Involving Animals Regulations 2018. Now, what it's proposed in those is they are actually made under the Animal Welfare Act, and the idea is that they will replace the Animal Boarding Establishments Act, which, as I indicated, was 1963, so quite an old piece of legislation. It is also seeking to replace the Pet Animals Act, which is 1951, which deals with the licensing of pet shops, and dog breeding legislation, which similarly is an old piece of legislation. So it is just really to make you aware that those new regulations are out for consultation. The intention is that they will come into force in October 2018. That may or may not take place, it may slip. But the indication, having looked at the draft regulations, really they're dealing with the administration of the license. So they set out the activity. It deals with more than just those three pieces that I've referred to, but it sets out what activities require a license, the penalties for non-compliance, that type of thing. So it won't actually impact should you adopt the model conditions. We would still, under both regimes, be saying, here's your license, and we will refer to the model conditions when we attach conditions to your license of how you need to comply with animal welfare. So it's just to highlight that at this stage, although we don't know what the final form of those regulations will actually be now. Just briefly moving on, pet shops. There are 3 licensed pet shops within the borough. We didn't get any response from the consultation that we sent out to them, which is not really surprising because it's not considered that the new conditions will actually impose any onerous requirements upon them. Again, it's more management and operational changes which are relatively easily brought into being. And dog breeding, we have no licensed dog breeders, so actually imposing the more modern model conditions won't directly impact on anybody, and we've not got any inquiries from anybody proposing to set one up. So actually it's fine to bring those in sort of immediately for new premises. With all of these, obviously what we're proposing is that for new premises which haven't been licensed before, if we received inquiries, if you decide to adopt them, then once that takes place, we will provide them with the model conditions and say this is what you have to comply with from the outset. There's also, again, very briefly, prerequisites. Really, they deal with some of the issues which are not directly related to animal welfare, but nonetheless are still relevant when we're considering the issue of a licence. So have you got planning consent? Have you got an appropriate electoral certificate? Are you suitably qualified? Those sorts of things. And we basically would like members just to agree the adoption of those, so that if somebody challenges us and says, where does it say I have to provide an electrical certificate? As well as obviously talking about health and safety, we can also say that members have resolved to adopt that as a requirement, a prerequisite of issuing a licence. So unless there's anything else, I'm quite happy to take questions.
Yes. Home boarding, I know a lot of people out there do dog walking for people where they look after the animals most of the day. Does that come under this act?
Not at the moment. The model conditions relate to commercial boarders. The proposed regulations do actually make specific reference to the licensing of home boarders, and so it is likely that in due course model conditions relating to home boarders will be produced dealing with those.
Councillor Smith?
The removal of condition E and the change of condition D, I'm a little concerned about the fact there is now no compliance date, because how do we then enforce anything if there's no date by which to become compliant? Is there not a date that we could agree on somewhere if the ones we had suggested were not appropriate?
I think we'd have been all right had it not been for maybe problems in the east.
I mean, we, as I say, you could choose to leave those compliance dates in. What essentially the updated recommendations, what we're proposing is that we will, over the course of the next year, go out and inspect all of the premises, establish exactly where the variances are between their existing licence and the current licence, and we will then consult with them and agree a timetable for upgrading. Part of that agreement will be based upon the cost, the impact on the business, the impact on the customers as to whether or not there's an availability of boarding for their animals, and we would obviously be seeking to achieve that within a reasonable time frame. But there are some examples or situations where, for example, it deals more with the space requirements. So if you have a brick built kennels and all of a sudden what was suitable for one dog is now not suitable for one dog, the only way in which you can achieve compliance is quite significant sort of construction really of new kennels, and hence why we're not seeking to achieve full compliance by the dates. As I say, you could leave in and basically say that apart from those matters that are considered to be significant, either in terms of cost or time, could be left for a long, to discretion, if you like, for a longer term compliance. But those that are considered to be less so, we could still seek to achieve. And the reality is we would seek to secure compliance within that sort of 3-year time frame anyway. But you could actually specify it if you so wished.
I think I'd be a bit more comfortable with that, because at the moment we are potentially agreeing to a policy that we have no date from which we can enforce it. So it seems a little senseless.
I think what we're doing, or what hopefully we may be doing, is giving the powers to Sean to make the decisions on our behalf. I don't know whether you'd be happy with that. I'm quite happy with it.
I'm perfectly happy with that. I just think we need to have some way of enforcing this policy. Otherwise, the policy has no grounds.
Councillor Watts?
Thank you, Chair. So, Sean, I'm taking it from what you've said that we would have a working agreement with the parties involved. If you felt that they weren't coming to the table, would you then come back to this committee and seek to import some timescale to having dates that we could then adhere to? In other words, tightening up the process if you felt that was necessary. Obviously, you're a professional and we take you and trust your judgment. I'm very happy with what was been proposed, but do you have the license, as it were, to come back to this committee and go, I'm not happy with what's going on, I now wish to put dates around this, please?
Can I just come in quick, if I may? As I understand it, with your delegated authority, everything's okay within Christchurch. It's just that East Dorset have a little problem. I mean, if we're okay in Christchurch, surely it'd be up to East Dorset to, they've got to go through it. You've got to speak to them, haven't you?
Sorry, my point being that if the problem isn't in Christchurch, then we are allowing ourselves to have a policy that's not necessarily enforceable because it has no enforcement dates on it. However, we don't have a problem, so why not make it enforceable?
Yeah, I see your point, but of course it does say that down there specifically that this will begin in January 2018. They got to 2019, and eventually it's got to be up and running by 2020. It's got to.
And I believe that the officer has proven his professionalism that at the end of the day, you will have the ability to enforce anyway.
If I can perhaps I can clarify, because I think we are seeking to remove the date. However, the authority would be delegated down to me. If we hit a situation where we'll call it a management compliance, and as you say, if we said to them, okay, you have to change your record keeping system so that you're recording correct information. So actually it's not that onerous, but if basically they, each year there was an excuse and a reason not to, the way in which we would seek to deal with it, having agreed the timescale up front, and if we couldn't seek an agreement of timescale, what we would do is actually bring the matter before either the licensing subcommittee and have a hearing effectively, so that we would present the rationale and the reasoning as to why we were imposing that particular timescale or seeking to impose it, and the licensee would have the ability to put forward their case as to why they felt that was an unreasonable or an unnecessary requirement in terms of time. So there would then be an ability to actually bring the matter to a conclusion, because as you say, otherwise potentially it's excuse after excuse or reason after reason, and we are unable to actually satisfactorily conclude the matter, which is really what we're seeking to do with a lot of these policies, is to give us the ability to draw a line and reach a final point.
I'm happy if you feel it's robust enough.
Councillor Loss, did you want to say something?
Chairman, I've got a couple of quick questions, if you'd allow me. The breeding of pups in private houses, which are then sold, is not apparently covered by this.
The current legislation is very ambiguous with regard to when hobby breeding, if we call it that, as you say, people who breed within their own homes, tips over into being a commercial operation. At the moment, the guidance is that if you operate a business for the breeding and sale of dogs, then you require a license. Unhelpfully, the guidance used to say that if you had more than 2 breeding bitches, then you required a license. That was changed to say if you had 5 or more litters in any one year, then you were classed as a business and you required a license. So it is very unclear, and we do work with some hobby breeders to make sure that if they do require a license, then they are licensed. The proposed regulations that I referred to, they actually amend that particular requirement yet again, and they make it clear that if you have 3 litters a year and you advertise those litters for sale, then you are classed as being a commercial breeder and you would then require a license. So it's a bit unclear, but essentially at the moment, if you had if you showed dogs at Crufts and you had a couple of litters, you wouldn't necessarily be covered. But if you were having litters and purely for sale and profit, then as long as we could get the evidence, and that's the difficult bit, then you would require a license at the moment. But as I say, very ambiguous, a very, very grey area, and difficult to actually enforce the requirements.
If I can just add to that, I have heard of friendly neighbours informing the inland revenue. But am I right in saying that mini mogs, the small cats, are not owned by anybody?
I'm not aware of.
You mean feral cats?
No, cats bred a kitten in a private house. People try to sell them on. My understanding, there is no legal ownership, and it's up to the cat where it wants to go.
Yeah, there's probably two slightly different. The legislation only refers to the breeding and sale of dogs.
Yeah.
So at the moment, breeding and sale of cats isn't actually legislatively controlled. I think also what you're referring to is the sense that whilst there are other controls over dogs and their behaviour, cats are classed as feral, and they are able to go where they want when they want, and there's no legal control over that.
So,
John, can I just ask, the reason you're asking this is because you're obviously taking in a lot of stray cats, and you're worrying about getting rid of them.
I'm sure all of us have cats all over the place, whether we want them or not. And there becomes the question of who, if anybody, owns them. And I thought you could come here and see the not the cat officer, the
Animal welfare.
Yeah, the animal welfare people, and say that there were cats with kittens or whatever, and that was the fastest way to do something about it, and i.e. that is a power in the hands of this council, is it not?
I'm not sure that this is anything to do with cat and dog kennels. We're talking about professional cat and dog kennels, and these regulations apply just to them, not your home mog who's having babies all over the place. Get rid of them. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions of the officer, please? Shall we go to debate then, Councillor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Sean, thank you very much for a robust and in-depth overview. I am quite happy with the explanation that you gave us, referenced the dates and the powers that you have as a professional. On the update sheet that we've been given, Chair, I presume that we're quite happy to go and if I recommend these on block.
Yeah.
So if we go for A to F, as stated out on the update sheet, I'm quite happy to set out as is. And that's about all I have to say on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Nissel, did you like to come in there?
I'm very happy to second, as long as we're happy that it's robust enough.
Okay, we've had a proposal. Any more debate, by the way? Good. We've had proposal. It's been seconded. All those in favour, please show. Thank you, members. Sean, thanks very much. I'm sure you want to wend your weary way. Unless you want to stop and listen to about community safety and things. Okay, item 6, while Sean is tidying his papers. I certainly don't intend going through this mass of papers that I presented to you. I just want to go very briefly just to point out the salient points. As you know, this committee, for some reason, is responsible for community safety. And because I am the member that sits on the Community Safety Criminal Justice Board, the Community Safety Partnership, and the Police and Crime Panel, that's why those papers are appended. So very briefly then, what you've got there are the papers for the Community Safety and Criminal Justice Board meet in July this year, pages 83 to 90. Pages 55 to 65 include the sexual violence strategy. Pages 71 to 74, reducing reoffending. 75 to 82, which is quite important, restorative justice. This is now law in Dorset, restorative justice. It's contained in 75 to 82. Bit of background, members. The Community Safety and Criminal Justice Board deliver a number of functions on behalf of the Pan Dorset Community Safety Partnerships. The purpose of the board is to coordinate the activity of community safety and criminal justice partners at a strategic level. The board reports to the statutory community safety partnerships in Dorset. Right, the agenda also contains details of a police and crime panel meeting in June of this year. Those pages are 91 to 119. Also, you've got the agenda for the Dorset CSP meet in June this year. And finally, the community safety plan is shown at pages, this is the community safety plan for the whole of the county, pages 131 to 135. That's the community safety plan for 2017 to 2020. And I'm sure there won't be any questions. Thank you, member. There are. Councillor Nottage has jumped straight in.
Thank you for that explanation, Mr. Chairman. I have to say, I express my complete and utter astonishment that this committee is responsible for Dorset-wide, Dorset Pan community safety. I find it quite remarkable. I just would like the committee members, if we are going to take this on, to understand what it means. Section 17 of the Crime and Disorder Act implications states quite clearly, without prejudice to any other obligation imposed on it, it shall be the duty of each authority to which this section applies to exercise its various functions with due regard to the likely effect of the exercise of those functions on and the need to do all that is necessary to prevent crime and disorder in its area, including antisocial and other behavioural adversity affecting the local environment, and the misuse of drugs, alcohol, and other substances in the area, and reoffending in its area. Can I further add that as part of our corporate plan, we have areas in respect of maintaining crime levels within the lowest quartile nationally, and maintaining the big problem, maintaining the low level of fear of crime. Now, what we have here, and unfortunately, because that's what I do, I did read all of this material, which is in front of us. And the thing that stuck out to me quite clearly is the word Christchurch didn't appear into it once through any of the papers whatsoever. So I am now confused as to whether or not this committee, and I think members should actually understand this, are being made responsible for Pan Dorset crime reduction at the expense of understanding what is happening in Christchurch. Because as far as I can see, although I tried to find quite clearly what was happening, in order that I could actually say that I was adhering to the conditions that are set by Section 17 of the Crime and Disorder Act 1998 and our corporate plan. Now, I understand and am quite prepared to accept what you say in respect of the fact that this is in the too difficult column to do, because it happens that you actually do a very good job on the committee, Mr. Chairman. But I think it needs some scrutiny to actually understand what it is that we are supposed to be doing as a licensing committee to actually adhere to the requirements that I've read, and our objective and our objectives, and understanding what the difference is between the crime levels that we're talking about in Christchurch and the overall crime strategy for Pan Dorset. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Councillor. All I can say to that is that you're all aware that I am the delegated member that represents Christchurch per se on all matters relating to community safety. You mentioned in your preamble that you didn't see Christchurch mentioned at all. Well, if you look through those papers, Ray, you will see that I represent Christchurch. When you look at the agenda, when you look at the minutes, you will see that Councillor Bernie Davis represents Christchurch Borough Council. I have the interest of this borough in mind when I attend all of these meetings. Now, going back to your other point, and I do understand where you're coming from, because I was the member that attended all these various panels, it was assumed, no, that's the wrong word, not assumed, and I'm also the chair of licensing, the powers that be decided that community safety would come within the licensing gambit. It's the only way I can look at it. But I'm sure you're going to tell me that really it comes under community, and I'm sure possibly it does come under community. But I am not on the community committee anymore. Over to you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, you took it as some sort of criticism. It's not meant as a criticism of you, because whilst you're there as Christchurch, and I appreciate that you do attend most regularly and diligently in respect of the responsibilities that you have in this respect, what I was saying about Christchurch in these papers is that I don't see any figures or any details as to what this committee responsibilities are in respect of, for instance, antisocial behaviour, which I understand is going through the roof because of the change in the, well, possibly because of one of the issues associated with the change in youth facilities and youth provisions across the county, and especially in Christchurch. There's nothing in here. So what is it that this committee is supposed to be doing for Christchurch in respect of the statistics that we are supposed to be engaged with within our respective, considering our responsibilities of the Crime and Disorder Act and our corporate plan?
Well, maybe you'd like to make a recommendation then that we can take forward.
My recommendation is that this should be dealt with at the highest possible level by community, irrespective of your chairmanship, because as far as I'm concerned, the community or scrutiny can call you into a meeting at any time. It's absolutely, we are impotent around this table in terms of licensing to be able to make any difference at all. This is a community issue, and from community issue, it should go to full council, as it always has been done before, and to scrutiny.
Well, you said full council, and that's quite right, because if you've seen the agenda for the next full council meeting, outside bodies is on the agenda. So maybe the matter can be brought up there. No, Councillor Watts first. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make the point, I know this will go to full council, and I know that the good members around this committee have read this, as is Councillor Nottage has, in great depth. I know it'll go to full council, and all members will get a chance and opportunity to look at the reports that you've picked up and you've taken in part. But perhaps we might want to push this to another committee for them to overview. Am I take it correct, Mr. Councillor Nottage, that you want to push this through to scrutiny for scrutiny to scrutinise this?
Well, scrutiny have a routine and annual involvement in actually understanding the requirements for the police results and the requirements for crime and disorder reduction, etc. What I'm concerned about is the fact that here we have a committee that is impotent in actually making any decisions to make a difference, especially in respect to the actions that we have in the situation we have in Christchurch. If we're going to do a job, then give us some tools to be able to make a difference. There's nothing here. There's no indication, for instance, of levels of sexual offences in Christchurch. There's no levels in here in respect of antisocial behaviour, which we used to have, and on that basis, some sort of strategy which enables us to contribute. There's nothing at all. It's been put into the too difficult column, the too difficult file, Mr. Chairman. It should be taken out quickly and put back into community, where it should be exercised with due diligence and importance of the subject in terms of what our responsibilities are under Section 17 and the responsibilities in the corporate plan.
Yep, point taken, Councillor. Thanks for that. There is a performance update contained within those papers, pages 41 to 54. but because you've all read them, you knew they were there anyway. Councillor Smith.
Can I suggest we refer it to scrutiny, but with the proviso that they look at its bearing on Christchurch in particular, and then they could potentially refer it to community for any decisions that would be made in the future.
Sounds like a good idea. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm quite happy, Chairman, to go along with that recommendation and second that.
Chairman, I must come back if you don't mind. You said 41 to 54. Well, that's precisely the point I'm making. Christchurch is not mentioned anywhere. It's associated with Pam Dorset. I understand that. I think it's creditable that that's what's going on. So what is being said is that this committee has a responsibility in respect of Pam Dorset. And it doesn't make any sense to me. So I think it needs to be sorted, and it needs to be actually put back into communities as quickly as possible so that we can actually adhere to the responsibilities as a council that we have.
Yeah, we will go to the vote, but I have to say, I mean, we've known that licensing has been responsible for community safety now since the new setup, which was when? March? It's now nearly November, and we've only just decided that we want to go somewhere else because we're not happy.
Mr. Chairman, we haven't had any papers before. These are the first time we've had any papers. It's the first time there's been a realisation that something completely bizarre is going on in respect of the management of this council.
Actually, you may be right there, but every time I go to an outside body, as do the other officers, just a minute, Ray, you're not the leader now. Every time I go to an outside bodies meeting, I put a report in as is requested by all members who are members of the outside body. It's not my fault that they're not appended to the papers until months later. Anyway, we'll press on. Sorry,
I'm not accusing you. I made that point quite clear. You diligently follow what you have to do and what you've been asked to do.
Okay, you've made your point, Councillor. Thank you very much. We will take your point up. We've had a recommendation on the table. I've just asked councillors.
We shouldn't put the responsibility for these views and what should happen directly through our committee clerk. I think we should pass the views expressed in the minutes to the chief exec and ask him to sort it out, because he is responsible for running the mechanism of the bit with our approval. Thank you.
Fine, I'm happy with that, but there is a recommendation. Lisa.
Do you want me to redo my recommendation?
Yeah.
So I'm going to recommend that we pass this to scrutiny with a specific overview of looking at the effects on Christchurch, and obviously they can then forward it to community if they see fit.
Anybody want to second
Can I
that?
just add that with the objective of actually moving this back into the community, moving it back into the community committee.
Councillor Lofts?
Chairman, I'm happy with what's said, but I would like added passed to scrutiny committee through the chief executive. We can't tell scrutiny what to do. We can't say what scrutiny can have on their agenda. We have a committee clerk with us now, and the minutes will say what should happen to it. In that case, it should go through the chief executive, because that's what it's there for. Thank you.
Point taken. Thanks for that, John. Have we got a seconder on that proposal, please?
Quite happy to second, Chair.
Then we go to the vote, please. You've heard the proposal and the seconder. Yep. All those in favour? Yeah. Any against? Any abstentions?
I abstain. I'm a member of the scrutiny committee, and I don't think it would be.
So am I, Mr. Chairman, but I don't believe that gives us a pecuniary interest at all.
No.
Right, that being the case, thank you for your time. Thank you for the officer's time. I think the meeting has come to an end at 18:57. 7 o'clock for you.